Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Stand By Me is the name of a 1986 comedy drama film directed by Rob Reiner and adapted from the Stephen King novella, The Body. And it was nominated for an Academy Award and twice for a Golden Globe Award. It's an absolutely great classic of a movie. In that film, we see two pairs of young boys very much embroiled in what they see as deep philosophical discussions. Both conversations raise all kinds of questions that are going to be the focus of today's episode. The conflict between faith and science, especially as it pertains to Adam and Eve, the primal couple in the book of Genesis. The one conversation between characters played by Will Wheaton and River Phoenix is a conflict over how education divides people who were once the best of friends. I think how that pertains to faith and science doesn't need to be unpacked for our listeners. In the other conversation going on at the same time, the characters played by Corey Feldman and Jerry O'Connell are debating who is the greater superpower, Superman or Mighty Mouse.
You think Mighty Mouse could beat up Superman? What are you, cracked? Why not? I saw the other day he was carrying 5 elephants in one hand.
Boy, you don't know nothing. Mighty Mouse is a cartoon. Superman is a real guy. No way a cartoon could beat up a real guy.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Would be a good fight, though.
On the one hand, they're talking about two superpowers pitted against each other, with people on the sideline wondering who will win. Just like faith and science, and again, especially as it pertains to Adam and Eve, the primal couple in the book of Genesis. And then there's that one really great line.
Mighty Mouse is a cartoon. Superman is a real guy. No way a cartoon could beat up a real guy.
Only a cartoon can beat up a real guy. Was Adam a real guy or just a cartoon? Will the cartoon version Adam, that he's a metaphor, be able to win out over the real historical guy, Adam? Faith and science had so often been in conflict. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric about them not being in conflict, but there's always some kind of hot-button issue creating a lot of friction between the two. A few centuries ago, the issue was the cosmos itself, with astronomers like Copernicus, Giordano Bruno, and Galileo Galilei squaring off against the Roman Catholic Church, pushing back on the standard geocentric model of the universe, which describes the sun, moon, and stars orbiting around the Earth, and replacing that with the heliocentric model that we now embrace today. Later in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, there was a new battle line. Everyone was talking about the new geology that seriously questioned the idea of a global flood. The faith and science dialogue then was all about Noah and his ark and the reconstruction of Earth by the floodwaters. Soon after that, physicists and astronomers started finding evidence that described a very old Earth, possibly even a few 100,000 years old, if you can believe it. And then extending that age of the Earth, end of the universe, back millions of years and then billions of years. Those disputes took a long time to resolve. Both of those points about the young age of the Earth and a global flood, they were still hot-button issues even 50 years ago. And even though those new positions are being broadly conceded in church circles today, we can still hear echoes of that debate. Think Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, and his great Ark adventure. So, Scott, were these ever issues in any church that you went to, that you were involved with?
Well, for sure. In fact, when I think back to my early days, when I first became a believer, these issues were front and center. They were some of the key, let's say, challenges to belief that got a lot of attention. So the Institute for Creation Research was very popular. And in all the churches that I attended, pretty much would have subscribed to that kind of a model, that young Earth, young Earth anti-evolution kind of model.
And did you or people from your church ever get these the brochures and the booklets and things from Answers in Genesis and that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, Answers in Genesis wasn't created at that point. I'm that old, but people like Dwayne Gish, for example, who was very popular, in the U.S., and Henry Morris had written very popular books on these subjects, and that was some of the first things that I read as a new believer. The idea was, to bolster my faith in the Bible,
and more to convince the people in the pews. Yeah,
for sure. The church I attended, interestingly enough, had a physics professor from the University of Windsor, very esteemed professor, and he wasn't of that, mindset. He came and did a presentation on astronomy, and in that presentation, unavoidably, really, he talked about the age of the universe and things like that, and it created quite a stir, actually, because he was a very highly respected man. He was very prominent in the church, and I think people were kind of taken back by that. So that was kind of an interesting moment.
Like a question period that got too heated, or was he chased out of the church?
No, he wasn't, but people were very uncomfortable with it, and there was a feeling that he just doesn't understand properly. He was kind of brushed aside, I guess.
Bring in the expert to tell them the expert information, and then you just dismiss him as he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think the thing that confused people was that you couldn't deny his faith. It was clear that he was a very solid Christian fellow, and really he saw science as something that really fit in with his faith as a physicist, but not in the way that people maybe wanted at that time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even as that intellectual wave was receding and older theology was becoming more mainstream, another battle line was being drawn. Christian apologetics identified a new arch nemesis, and the church found a new shibboleth: Darwinism and biological evolution, being advanced by a new and different army, this one led by archaeologists, paleontologists, and biologists. Scott, I'm sure you were there in church when that became issues, that whole evolution question.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Pretty much from the outset. I mean, the threat of evolution, as it was perceived, was materialism. That if evolution is true, then the atheists are right. All we have is a material universe. There's no room for a God in that picture. And the feeling was, if we concede on the evolutionary front, then we've lost the game.
In that sense, it very much became a shibboleth, a dividing line. Yeah, you were there too. So that conflict too is beginning to fade as more and more religious thinkers are finding ways to integrate biological evolution into Christian theology. And increasingly, people sitting in the pews are getting, let's say, comfortable with the idea, even incorporating it into their worldview. They would now say that God used evolution and natural selection to create the diversity of life forms in the same way that he used the Big Bang to create the diversity of planets and stars. But there were limits to the stretching of their theology. It was okay to talk about plants and animals evolving into different life forms, but many still draw a big, bold line at humans. This is our topic for today. And to help us navigate it, we've reached out to Dr. Denis Alexander. Denis has a PhD in neurochemistry and spent 40 years in biomedical scientific research. He now has taken on emeritus status, and one thing that means is you can say whatever you want. And he's turned his experience, his energies, and his passion towards contributing to the dialogue between faith and science. He's an emeritus fellow at St. Edmund's College and is also founding director and emeritus director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, both at Cambridge and with funding support from John Templeton Foundation. He writes and speaks extensively on many faith and science topics, often on evolution in general and human evolution in particular. So this is a real treat for us, Denis. Welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be here. Thank you.
Denis, when I contacted you earlier about speaking on the subject of human evolution, one of the first things you commented on was how this seems to be so much more an issue in North America. Human evolution is very much a hot topic, especially in the U.S. We see this in public opinion polls, in articles written at various Christian apologetic websites. I come across it in conversations with people, and we found this in our season 3 series of episodes. Once we did a few episodes on human evolution, we saw clear signs of some of our audience quite reacting against that. It was obvious they did not like that part of the conversation. So, Denis, it may sound like a topic that doesn't need to be discussed, but again, this was a major stumbling block for people like myself coming from a very fundamentalist background. But it doesn't seem to be such a big thing in the UK, you tell us.
I don't think it's such a big thing in the UK, no. And I think the UK's just got a different history, and the churches have a different history. I mean, I was raised in a very conservative Christian home, actually. It was Brethren, Christian Brethren, if you have those sort of groups in Canada. And to be honest, it was never an issue in our church, in our local assembly. It was never an issue with my parents. And I've often thought about that, because even when I went to Oxford to study biochemistry in the mid-1960s, I was president of the Christian Union there, a great, InterVarsity fellowship, great big, several hundred strong Christian fellowship. And I've compared notes with colleagues from that era just to make sure I'm not sort of, thinking wrong about what happened. But none of us can remember ever hearing about creationism. I mean, the terminology didn't exist, and you can't really talk about something if you don't have a word for it. And so at that point, clearly it did exist in different parts of the world, but we just simply never came across it. And so when there were apologetics talks about science and faith, they were about reductionism, they were about the brain and mind and those kind of issues, which are very important. But there was never talk about evolution or creationism, actually, that I can remember. Then it came into the churches here later on. It was an export from the USA, to be quite honest.
What about the aspect of evolution that pertains to humans? I mean, it's one thing to talk about plants and animals evolving, but what about humans? Was that ever an issue for your church, for your friends and family, or even for you yourself?
I can never remember it being an issue for my friends and family. It may be partly because my mother was a scientist. She'd read physiology at Oxford. I suppose, that had an influence. But having said that, I mean, certainly if you're asking the question now today, in the more conservative or evangelical churches in the UK, certainly human evolution will be an issue for many people, not for everybody, but for many people. And, I go to a Baptist church here now in Cambridge, where we have a few hundred people coming on Sunday morning. And I'm sure there would be some there might have an issue with human evolution. And I do know I know three personally who are good friends, who are proper creationists, actually. So we've got at least 3 out of 300. Maybe there are more, but it's that kind of number, I think, you find in churches here.
And when you say proper creationists, do you mean like a term that we might use, that I certainly would use, would be young Earth creationists? Because we would still say God created, but he used evolution. What do you mean by creationists?
Yeah, I was thinking when I say proper creationists, I'm really thinking about young Earth creationists when I use that phrase. Yeah, but it's quite correct to clarify that point. That's important. Yeah.
You're just curious if you have any ideas as to why that situation has come to exist in Britain, because earlier on in the early days of evolutionary theory, Huxley had the famous debate with the Archbishop, and the history books will certainly position that Huxley won that debate pretty clearly. And was the issue somewhat kind of settled in Victorian Britain, and is that why it kind of faded away? Or
yeah, no, it's a very good question. It was Bishop Wilberforce, Soapy Sam, as he used to be called. Yeah, I mean, that particular debate has been heavily mythologized, and it's been deconstructed actually by quite a lot of historians who said actually it wasn't the great debate that you get. We've had it on television here and all that sort of thing, but it's been kind of dramatized a lot and many times. No, what's interesting actually is that the Anglican Church in particular, were quite quick to come to terms with Darwin and evolution. I mean, the main opposition he got was from his fellow scientists, or natural philosophers, as they were called still in those days. And that was, because they just felt it's too theoretical, it's not supported enough by the data. They had very strict understanding of what is scientific data and, what sort of theories you should propose. So Darwin had a hard time from his fellow scientists, actually, but much more so than from theologians. And the reason is, of course, he was, as you know, he was a student here in Cambridge, just down the road from where I'm speaking. He was a student at Christ's College, and he was taught by Anglicans. All the people who taught science here in Cambridge until 1871, they were Anglican priests. They had to be ordained in the Church of England. And of course, they taught him science. So he learned his geology from an Anglican, teacher and so forth, Sedgwick. And the rest of all his teaching was from Anglicans. And the Anglican Church absorbed Darwin in theory into its theology, if you like. It baptized it very quickly, if I can put it like that, into a kind of Christian theology very early. And so if you look at the exam papers in the University of Cambridge here, by the mid-1860s, that's only 5 or 6 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, you find already questions about Mr. Darwin's theory, which assume the truth and validity of Mr. Darwin's theory. Apply Mr. Darwin's theory to this question or that question, you see. So that happened pretty quickly. Catholics took a little bit longer, but not very much longer. But within a few decades of the origin of species, I would say all the major denominations in this country, all the mainstream Christian communities were favorable towards Darwinism, absorbed it into their theology. They had a much stronger theology than came along in the 20th century when theology got weak. They had a strong biblical theology, and I think if you have that, I don't think there's any problem with taking Darwinian evolution on board, actually.
It's interesting that you mentioned Anglicanism and the mainline churches because, it seems that generally, even in North America, I think that was the case where the mainline churches did adapt to evolutionary theory fairly early on. And evolution debate, in a lot of ways, came about at around the same time that the fundamentalist split was happening in North America, when
Right.
the mainline churches were splitting apart over the fundamentalist issue. And it's no coincidence to me that those two things happen somewhat simultaneously. And in North America, at least, it is the more sectarian churches who have been more anti-evolution than the mainline churches. So that's kind of interesting what you're saying.
What's interesting about the fundamentals, the original essays, when you read them, several of them are written, B.B. Warfield would be an example, by those who really was very favorable towards evolution. Okay.
Yeah.
So even the fundamentalists, didn't have, several of them anyway, didn't have any problem with evolution and rather liked it, actually. So as an irony,
right.
Had a big irony. Okay, sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're right. It is quite ironic that is the case. And even Charles Hodge, Warfield's teacher, he was a little more conservative on the issue, but some of the things that he wrote about the interface between science and faith were much more progressive than what happened kind of later on. Fundamentalism, as a movement, changed pretty radically over those first 10 or 2. It became increasingly, I guess, but what you call sectarian, and so that is a very interesting point, and it's something I've often pointed out to friends that are hardcore creationists, is to say, well, one of the greatest American theologians that most people really look up to, he was a theistic evolutionist, Warfield. So yeah.
And
So
also,
let's talk.
none of the
Go ahead.
people in
Yeah.
the 19th century, at the time of Darwin, there were no young Earth creationists at the time of Darwin. They didn't really exist. The age of the Earth, okay, they didn't know what the age of the Earth was. They knew it was very old, and that had already been emerging by the early years of the 19th century, actually. And so, young Earth creationism really was not a problem for in Darwin's time. Because people didn't believe in the young Earth. Everybody knew the Earth was very old, but they just didn't know how old at that point.
Okay. How would you account for somebody like Bishop Ussher and his famous idea about, the Earth being around 6,000 years old? And he actually, I think he got it right down to the date and time of creation.
Date and time, yes.
Yeah.
He did. We still have an old family Bible, and it's written in the margin. I love it,
Yeah.
Right? Genesis chapter 1, it was, what was it, 4004 at a certain time? I don't remember the date now.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was pretty out of the ordinary. Exceptional.
Okay.
There were some like that. Philip Henry Goss was another famous person. His son wrote this famous Victorian sort of account of his background called Father and Son and so forth. So you've got these people who are often quoted as if they represented, the era of their time, but they didn't. And that's always the danger of digging out historical quotes, isn't it? That, well, most of the time, they don't necessarily represent a majority view by any means, so there might have been a minority view who took that view. But Philip Henry Goss, he believed in, he was a young Earth creationist, you could say, but he got teased a lot for his beliefs, at that time by the Christians as well as non-Christians.
It's interesting you bring him up because, he's mainly known to people through his son's, scathing autobiography. And I read a fascinating biography on him a few years ago. And this biographer was really arguing against that, in the sense that he was saying that, Philip Henry Goss was actually a very good scientist and very positive toward science and nature, and spent his life really studying wildlife and categorizing things. And anyway, he just presented a very, very different picture than emerges from his son's autobiography. So he's another one that seems to have maybe been maligned in an unfair way.
And Darwin used some of his data. Darwin is a correspondent of Henry Goss.
Is that right?
Yeah, he was the main. He was best known marine biologist of his time, actually. In fact, if you really want to know, it so happens because I just dug them out from my library. But here we are, Marine Zoology. There you are, original editions.
Oh, nice.
Volume 1, Volume 2. And
Wow.
they are inscribed by my grandfather, who did medicine up in Glasgow. And on the inside, here you are, S.P. Alexander, the 16th of October, 1882. There we go.
Wow.
There they are. Yeah.
Just because you're showing off, I actually have, I don't have it to show and tell right here beside me, but I do have not a first edition, but a very early edition of Evenings Under the Microscope by Philip Henry Goss. And that's a great book. And just, he just spent hours and hours looking through his microscope and sketching out the various things that he saw. And he's one of the casualties, I think, of the so-called war of science and religion. But moving forward, we have this metaphor that's often discussed with regard to science and faith, which has become known as the two books metaphor. I believe that Galileo was one of the first to kind of propose this idea that there's kind of the book of God's word, the book of the Bible, where God reveals himself to us through his word. However, there's another book, and that's the book of nature, the book of the external world, the creation that the God of the Bible brought into being. And both those books have to be read together. However, what develops over time is they come into some conflict. In other words, we assume certain things when we read the Bible, and then we go look at the, quote, book of nature. So things like geology, for example, when we look at the book of nature, the earth appears to be very, very old. And many people believe the book of the Bible argues for a very young earth. Same thing with evolution and so on. It just seems that over the centuries, the book of nature and the book of scripture have become more and more somewhat in tension, let's say, or in many people's minds in outright conflict with each other. And so I'm just curious what you think of that metaphor. And
thank you. Well, it was, as you say, a very powerful metaphor. It was used by pretty much all the natural philosophers, who were Christians anyway, in the 17th century. You read Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, Hooke. Actually, Descartes has a similar sort of concept, really. Pretty much anybody is drawing upon that sort of understanding, that metaphor to make the points you suggested there. I think part of the tension that eventually rose was because people lost Augustinian theology. And that was a particular feature of the 19th century, where somehow people lost Augustine. And so they lost the way of reading texts. And had they gone back to Augustine's great so-called literal commentary on Genesis, 410 AD, whenever the final edition was, he had several sort of editions. If they'd read that, they would have begun to see, well, actually, the early church fathers had a very literary understanding, of the early chapters of Genesis. They didn't read it in any way as a sort of scientific text, really, but they read it, of course, they read it according to the science of their time, but it was a more literary composition. And I think that got lost in the 19th century by some people anyway. And then, of course, you got the rise of, sort of liberal theology coming out of Germany, sweeping across the end of the 19th century. But around the back of that is this sort of loss of Augustine, I think, and then reacting against the Bible as if, with modernist spectacles, as if it should be read like some kind of scientific textbook. I think that's part of that tension, I think.
Do you think that there was an underlying acceptance by many in the 19th century of the Enlightenment project? In other words, it may have been even almost unconscious, but there was an acceptance that things need to be brought to the bar of reason, and reason being the Enlightenment's definition of reason, and particularly empiricism, and that therefore the fight now needs to be between scientists, in a sense, bringing that to bear on the Bible. If the Bible doesn't stand up empirically, then it falls apart. So we have to defend it in that way. I don't know if I'm making my point clear there.
No, I understand. Yes, I think you're right. Probably for some Christian communities, I think that was an issue, and reading it all through modernist spectacles, if you like, but
Right.
with sort of understanding that we need to read this as if it's some sort of empirical, tested description of the natural world or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, that's really how young Earth creationism came about, really. Young Earth creationism really got going, didn't it, in the early 1960s with Whitcomb and Morris and the Genesis flood. And when you read it, you suddenly realize, they've got their modernist spectacles very strongly on, and they're reading it as a water engineer or whatever, and so that colors the whole kind of way they read the text. And I think it comes back to what we were talking earlier. I think that probably in Europe, with all the historic, very ancient European universities around, people just probably a bit more used to reading old texts, including, whether it's Shakespeare or, whatever, or the Bible or something else. I'm not saying they're similar texts in that way, but simply from the point of view of being old texts, they kind of understand that you have to read an old text within that context. You have to understand the text or seek to understand it according to the particular time and culture in which it was written, and so on and so on and so on. And I think because North America is young, dynamic, new, and lacks that sort of history of many centuries of old historic universities, I get the feeling that sort of got lost somehow.
Denis, what we want to do in the episode today is to look at how the two books they push back and forth on this idea of human origins. But before we talk about the Christian response to common ancestry, I want to take advantage of you being here as a fully qualified geneticist. And so the 20th century gave us a lot of fossilized bones, and it emphasized anatomical similarities, and that alone was compelling. But then the 21st century gave us a whole new kind of evidence, which I find is much more compelling. It makes it impossible, really, to deny that we're related to the great apes and the extinct hominids. And so I'm referring to the evidence that's in our genes, and that is your area of expertise. So maybe we could talk a little bit at this point about the major lines of genetic evidence that makes this story so compelling.
Yes, indeed. Well, you're absolutely right, of course, that our genes, I always think, are like a history book. And we're all carrying, not just one history book. We've got, 10 to the 13 cells in our bodies, something like that. It's a lot of cells, okay? Depends on our size, and, but, that gives a rough idea. And so we've got 10 to the 13 history books we're carrying around in our bodies every moment, which give the history of our evolution from a genetic perspective. And, of course, every cell of our body, except our red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus, but all the other cells basically contain all the DNA, the whole genome, the whole of our DNA information. And in there is the history book. So it's a wonderful package of history. And there are many different types of history that we can read there genetically, thinking genetically. One is actually the pseudogenes. Pseudogenes are genes that have had functionality in our precursors on the evolutionary history. But at some stage, a mutation came on board into the gene, and it lost its functionality, rather sadly in some cases. And you can think of, something like the gulo gene, it's called, which you'll find functionally operational in rats and mice and other mammals. And we need that gene, or they need that gene, in order to make vitamin C. But that gene was mutated a very long time ago, probably at least 40 million years ago, and it introduced just a single mutation into the gulo gene. So no longer can that gene make the enzyme which is necessary for making vitamin C. So we all have to eat our oranges and, make sure that we get plenty of vitamin C so we don't get scurvy. Rats and mice don't get scurvy, okay? They won't, because they can make their own vitamin C. Their gulo gene is functional. Ours is exactly the same as theirs, almost exactly the same. It's just got this single tiny point mutation, single tiny change. If you want to know, it's at nucleotide 97, actually. It's a genetic number 97 in a very long sequence. And we lack an A, the genetic letter A, at that particular point. That is sufficient to make that enzyme dysfunctional. But there it is. It's lying around in our genome, and that is a good bit of our history, historical evidence. And there are at least, they're being discovered all the time as people sequence more genomes, but something like 18,000, 19,000 pseudogenes in our genome. So it's incredibly powerful evidence. Yeah.
Many mammals have, in fact, I would say, I think you tell me, all mammals have this vitamin C making gene, the gulo gene, and it's functional essentially almost in all of the mammals, but in the line that we find humans along with chimps and orangutans and gorillas and other such hominids and great apes, that's where the gene is broken in that whole branch of the tree.
That is correct. Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
Is this what people refer to as, quote, junk DNA?
Well, not really. The term junk DNA is unfortunate, actually. It was used, I think, more by journalists, actually, in the early sort of years of DNA research. And it's a bad expression simply because we now know there's a whole lot of DNA that has functions that we didn't understand before. And although only a very small percentage of the human genome encodes proteins, probably a couple of percent, something like that, but many, many other parts of DNA are involved in regulating gene expression, that is, switching genes on and off. And so one has to be very careful. I don't personally use the term junk DNA because I think, it's a little bit misleading, actually.
Right. Well, I just bring it up because I know the ID movement, the intelligent design movement, loves to bring this up, and they love to point out that what was once thought to be junk DNA has been discovered not to be junk after all, and this is why the evolutionary model is suspect and so on. So yeah, I that's why I brought it up.
Well, I'd agree with what they say that the first part of what you said I agree with, but I don't think it's particularly relevant to. Well, it doesn't tell you anything particular about evolution. It's just terminology. Okay, so
yeah. So
yeah.
This gene that was turned off that produces vitamin C, there's no other function for that gene other than that one thing.
No, there's not actually. It's a bit like going into a factory and you get shown around the factory. They're making, let's say, very modern cars, making electric cars, and you go around the factory and they say, oh, we've got a museum here. Okay, you open the door and then they've got all the the cars they were making 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and so forth. It's like a museum. You go in there and look around, wow, you can that's fascinating, but they're no longer used, they're no longer functional. But you can tell a lot about the evolution of cars just by getting to that factory. So I think of pseudogenes a little bit like that, actually.
And along with pseudogenes, I understand there's evidence also of other genetic markers, things like virus infections that we had that tell the same story that happened in chimpanzees, for example.
That's exactly right. Yes. So about 8% of our human genome, of our DNA, actually comes from what we call retroviruses. Well, HIV is a good example of a retrovirus. And many, many times over our evolutionary past, retroviruses have infected whatever our precursors were in that particular lineage, our evolutionary precursors, and those retroviruses have inserted their DNA sequence into the germline, into the actual sex cells that are passed on to the next generation, or the DNA is passed on to the next generation. And so you get these amazing long sequences, some of them quite long sequences, which are a bit like, I think of sort of tattoo on the arm. You've got a tattoo that's marked on your arm, and there it is, and you can read it off, this great long sequence of genetic letters. And those are characteristic of viral sequences, and they can be identified in that way. And we have many, many of those. I mean, probably thousands and thousands. So those also can be used to trace the history of particular ape lineages or whatever lineage you want, really. They can be used to track back and back and back and to see where that first began in the evolutionary ancestry.
For example, you use the analogy of a tattoo, and a tattoo can be on any part of your body, the back of the neck, under your arm, on your kneecap. But what the data show us is that the tattoo is positioned in the exact same place in many hominid lines, including, well, chimps aren't hominids, but they're part of our ancestral tree. They had that same tattoo in the same spot, whereas other mammals may have those tattoos in completely random other places.
That is correct. So it's the location, and especially the sequence of that particular viral sequence, that is important. And you can see it Because we can sequence, obviously, we have sequences from thousands and thousands of animals that are that are alive today. So we can get the sequence data, and so you can track the point at which it enters into the evolutionary history. That's where you can actually, without any physical fossils, you don't need bones and things these days. You don't need fossils. You can build up a whole ancestral tree simply by looking at these sorts of sequence insertions right there in our own DNA. And the same is true of what we call transposable elements. These are jumping genes, where you get sort of copy and paste. We've got machinery inside our cells that copy and paste bits of DNA and then insert it into other parts of the DNA. And so those have a very similar sort of function. We share, I think, 99% of our transposons or jumping genes with chimpanzees, for example. And then you can track back again. You can use that to build up a sort of evolutionary tree of how that descent takes place. So that's also another way. Another genetic sort of bit of data which is fascinating, I think, are the chromosomal fusions. So this has been a really impressive bit of data, I think, which to get our heads around. But as you know, so we humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, whereas the great apes have 24 pairs. And so that story of our missing pair, if you like, has been a fascinating part of our human evolution discussion. And so what happened during evolution is that there are actually two separate ape chromosomes. We know them as 2p and 2q, and those fused together head to head to form our own chromosome 2. Chromosome 2 is actually the second largest of our chromosomes. So the chromosomes are numbered by the biggest starting and then getting smaller and smaller. So number 1 is the biggest, number 2 is the second largest. And so there's a kind of head-to-head fusion of the two ape chromosomes. And of course, we know that because we now can sequence, ape DNA, and we can sequence our own DNA, we can compare it. And when you have the telomere is the bit at the end of the chromosome, and that has a particular functional kind of sequence that will tell you this is a telomere. You can tell immediately just by the repetition of a certain sequence there. And so when you sequence your way down the human chromosome, lo and behold, chromosome number 2, you've got the 8 chromosomes head to head right there, and that's where they are. So you can see it immediately. So I think that's a very fascinating bit of data which strongly supports human evolution. Yeah.
Where it became important was people said, okay, there's no way that we have a common ancestry with the great apes because you can't lose an entire chromosome and be functional anymore. And then it was this discovery that, in fact, we have 23, but one of those 23 is actually 2 put together head to head.
That's correct. That's entirely correct. And then, of course, if you think, well, how did that happen in, exactly when that event took place, we don't really know. But when you think about it, when there's 2 ape chromosomes went head-to-head fusion, the DNA information is still there. It's still present. Okay, so they didn't lose it in that way. I mean, if it suddenly dropped out of the genome, then you'd have a problem. They would be dead, probably. Okay, so they wouldn't have any offspring. But no, all the DNA information the genetic information is still present.
And the analogy that I sometimes use for this, because people may not, they can't visualize centromeres and telomeres. So an analogy I'll sometimes use is that of just a film, a movie. We watch a movie, and you've got the opening credits where they talk about the people who made the movie, the producers and the companies that made the movie. Then you've got the movie for 2 hours, and then you've got the closing credits, everybody who played any role whatsoever in the movie. Now, if you take a movie, you're watching it, you see the opening credits, the main movie, and then part of the closing credits, but then all of a sudden you see some more closing credits, which are now running backwards. And then there's another movie, which is running backwards. And then the opening credits for that show that's moving backwards. And right away, as soon as you see that, okay, these are 2 films, 2 movies that were spliced back to back, head to head, or head to tail in this case. And it's very obvious that they were joined head to head. And just to reiterate what you just said a moment ago, we watch the movie backwards and it doesn't quite make sense. But in DNA, you can read it backwards and forwards and still work with the information exactly the same. Is that a good analogy?
I think it's a nice one. Yeah. Yeah, there are quite a few analogies. But I think, as you say, it's really helpful just to look at a picture,
Yes.
You can see the figure. I think I put it in my book, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? probably there's a figure in there, I think, just so people can visualize what was going on there, I think. And you'll find it, online and many other places, of course.
This discussion is fascinating because, and you've mentioned this already, that we're all carrying around pretty much a complete fossil record. The actual physical fossil record out there it's always been a major criticism of the creationists, that it's spotty, and they attack the dating of it and all these different kind of things. But you can put all that aside and just look at our DNA, and it's all there. The fossils, we're carrying them around with us.
Yeah, I think that's so ironic. I've heard young Earth creationists standing up and haranguing evolution and human evolution in particular. But then when I think, if only you could just look at your own DNA, you're carrying around the history right there in your body, just take a look. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting that in my discussions with people of that mindset, they haven't heard that news. The whole genetic revolution and how that has really had an impact on Darwinism and on this new synthesis they talk about and stuff like that. They're still back in the fossil record days, and they lean on that quite heavily. And I even remember years ago that people would say, well, we have a spotty fossil record, but once we understand things at kind of a molecular level, then we'll be vindicated. But just the opposite has happened. Evolution has become much, much stronger since we've had that ability, as opposed to the opposite. So evolution could be falsified very quickly if we had found our DNA to be quite different.
Absolutely. I often give that as an example. I mean, once the human genome was sequenced, it could have undermined evolution quite easily.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of data you can cite which in principle could counteract or even falsify evolutionary theory, but it hasn't happened yet anyway.
So, Dennis, all of this is nuclear DNA. And you made the comment, it was about 15 minutes ago, you were talking about how we have all these cells, 13 billion cells, or I forget the number you gave, but each of which has a nucleus. So all these copies of books inside of our bodies that have this history that tells about our origins. But then we come to a different kind of a DNA that's in a different organelle. The nucleus is one organelle. We have these things called mitochondria. We have thousands or millions of these in each cell. So if 13 billion cells, each with a book, isn't astounding enough, now we have these little books that there's thousands or hundreds of thousands of these in each one of those cells. The mitochondrial DNA story and Svante Pääbo. I don't know if you want to say a few things about that.
Yes, well, mitochondrial DNA has been incredibly useful, especially in the earlier years, for looking at ancestry and human evolution, and of course, evolution of animals and so forth. So mitochondrial DNA, it's quite useful because the mutation rate is about 10-fold higher in mitochondrial DNA than it is in nuclear DNA for various reasons. And so the clock is just it's a bit faster, really. We got a faster clock, which is quite convenient, actually. And of course, a lot of the dating of all kinds of events that happened in human evolution, for example, rather depend upon the mutation rate of nuclear DNA. But the mitochondrial DNA mutation rate is fairly well established, and it could be adjusted a little bit, but it's not going to make a huge difference because the mutation rate is so much faster. And also, mitochondrial DNA is inherited from our mothers. And so that's kind of useful because then you can just track back the mitochondrial DNA through the mothers and the mothers and the mothers. That's how you come up with this idea of mitochondrial Eve, of course, that if you track it all back, eventually you're going to come back to one source of that particular mitochondrial DNA in that particular population anyway. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that mitochondrial Eve, so-called, was the the founder of the whole human population or something like that. It's simply the other lineages from that particular individual have died out. Many lineages do eventually go extinct and they die out. And so it's kind of a back of the envelope kind of thing. You can just go back, try it out. You need a big envelope, but you go back and back and back to where you get to that mitochondrial Eve. And the same is true, of course, of Y chromosome Adam. The same is true that we males get our Y chromosome from our fathers. So and back you can go, and you come up with a Y chromosome Adam.
Right.
Yeah.
And this mitochondrial DNA, that's really the solid evidence. We have rock solid evidence for our common ancestry with Neanderthals and Denisovans as well. We can have evidence of that in our mitochondrial DNA, but it also tells us about our migration out of Africa. Very, very clear evidence of the various time periods and the paths we took out of Africa and into Europe. This is all coming out from the mitochondrial DNA story, as I understand it.
Well, it's coming out from both. It's not just mitochondrial DNA. It's coming out from nuclear DNA stories as well. And so there's a huge number of papers coming out every week. It's difficult to keep up really with population genetics. And, part of it is trying to track the genetic flow, if you like, of people around the world. And the out of Africa hypothesis is still holding up pretty well. I mean, it's got modified in various ways. As you probably know, there are two grand hypotheses. One is called the replacement hypothesis, whereby you have an ancient population of anatomically modern humans who come out of Africa and then they replace all the other hominids around the world that were living there. Or you actually have evolution in the separate parts of the world. So you have individual human evolution going on, in different parts of the world. I mean, it's ended up with a little bit of a mixture between those two grand hypotheses, but the replacement model is still probably sort of the dominant idea in the sense that between 40 and 60,000 years ago, according to the genetic data anyway, you get this population coming out of Africa that then basically populates the rest of the world. And so lots of strong evidence for that. One of the strong bits was simply that we all outside of sub-Saharan Africa, we've got some Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, about 2.9% to be precise, something like that. And so most sub-Saharan African populations don't have that Neanderthal DNA. And so the idea is that before probably 60,000 years ago, something like that, population of anatomically modern humans were emigrating out of Africa, and then they had sex with some Neanderthals, or perhaps they got raped, or whatever you want to say. But and so you got this Neanderthal DNA ending up in that population, which then subsequently populated the whole of the rest of the world as they migrated towards China and so on. Right. Now, there are various modifications that it can get complicated because there were some population groups that moved back to Africa again, and so you can get complications in the genetics. But that's a sort of broad picture, which is still holding up, I think, pretty well. And the other side of that, of course, is that within the African populations, there's more genetic diversity within the different populations of sub-Saharan Africa than you see in the whole of the rest of the world. That's simply because of our recent bottleneck history, if you like, of that population coming out of Africa, whereas a lot of evolution, human evolution, was clearly taking place in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years before they moved out. Fascinating story, really.
It is fascinating. So just a quick question, as a total layman in this discussion, at this point in history, is all human DNA the same? In other words, has it now mixed together to the point where we are all one not species maybe, but we all share the same DNA? Or are there still differences in actual DNA between people?
Well, we all are all similar enough in our genome sequence to be humans and to develop as humans and have linguistic capabilities and free will and consciousness and the ability to love God and various other very important facets of our personhood. Having said that, in fact, one thing that now we've got sequences of so many human genomes. I mean, what's striking actually is the diversity that you do see in the human population. So on average, we all vary from each other. If you pick anybody from around the world, any two humans from around the world, we all vary in about 0.5% of our genomes. It's quite high, really, when you think about it. Now, of course, a lot of that sequence doesn't make any difference at all. Okay, it doesn't make any difference at all. Some of it does make a difference. Now, of course, a figure that people will hear, they'll hear that we differ in 1 out of every 1,000 of our nucleotide bases, that is to say, our genetic letters differ about 1 over 1,000, which is correct, roughly speaking, on average. But what they tend to forget also that there are other types of variation in the genome. Some of them is called insertion deletions, little sequences that are inserted or deleted, and there are some quite large sort of structural changes in chromosomes and so forth. So the structural DNA changes and so forth. So if you add it all up, it actually comes to around about 0.5%, which is a lot higher than we thought even, 20, 30 years ago. And of course, some of it does make a difference. It does make a difference to our susceptibility to certain diseases, to our defense against certain pathogens, and perhaps we'll later on come on to the whole thorny issue of behavioral genetics. But it makes some differences. Yeah, that's right.
So if I can bring us back once again to the two books analogy, what I'm saying is that I wanted to first establish that we have evidence, it's undeniable that we have evidence for common ancestry with our living cousins, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, for example, but also our extinct cousins. I'm thinking Neanderthals and Denisovans. So that evidence is there. It's an overwhelming amount of data. And so we have the two books metaphor. We've got a problem because the first book seemed to be telling us one story, and this overwhelming data seems to be telling us a different story. And so in response to that, now we have a lot of books being written in the past 10 years, dozens and dozens of books from Christian scholars trying to somehow bring the science and the theology into harmony on this question of human origins. Denis, you yourself, you've written a book. We're going to talk in a minute about that. But C. John Collins has his Four Perspectives book where he brought in four scholars and they just debated the question. Peter Enns gave us the evolution of Adam. Dennis Venema and Scott McKnight, they co-wrote Adam and the Genome. Fuzz Rana, Reasons to Believe, wrote Who Was Adam? We'll talk as well about William Lane Craig and Joshua Swamidass, both of them writing in the past couple of years, their versions. There's so many books that are being written on this question of who was Adam? Was there an Adam? And so maybe we'll start, Denis, with your own view, because again, you did write about this and you have a view on who was Adam.
Right. Well, commenting on the number of books, I'm just so happy that I got my book out in 2008 in the first edition. Since then, I don't know if it started, there were so many people who disagreed. They had to write books about it. I don't know. I'm joking, but it's just amazing the tsunami of books that have come out since that, which is great. I mean, it's good that people are thinking about it and coming up with different models and different ideas. And one of my aims in my book actually was to present just various models, if you like, ways of understanding speculation, theological speculations about how we can relate the teaching, the biblical teaching, with contemporary anthropology, the sort of anthropology, human anthropology we've just been talking about. And so I don't hold strongly to any one particular view, I'll have to say. I do agree with those who would say, and William Lane Craig is one of these, that when you read especially the New Testament and the various mentions of Adam and Eve in the New Testament, it seems to be the understanding is that these were historical figures, in real time. They're not just symbols. They have a lot of theological import. They have a lot of theological content to their names and the way they're applied. And New Testament Adam and Eve are normally applied, if you like, in a context as to talk about sin. If you actually look at the number of times they're mentioned, not mentioned very many times, are they about 7 times in the New Testament? And also in the Old Testament, you could understand Adam and Eve. I mean, they come into genealogies, they're mentioned and so forth. So I think the understanding that these are real people in real time, I find quite attractive from a biblical perspective. But also, I suppose, just thinking about what happened in human history. I mean, I see the early chapters of Genesis as theological essays. And the theological essays seem to be indicating that there was a time when humankind had wonderful fellowship with God, and that fellowship was broken by sin. And, when you read Genesis 3, it's one of the most dramatic theological accounts of the consequences of alienation from God through sin that you read anywhere in the whole of the Bible, actually. And so that's sort of where my starting point is there. And then you go, yeah, but obviously the early chapters of Genesis, the theological essays, they're not going to tell us about genetics. They're not going to tell us about, human evolution. That's not what they're about. They're about something different. They're about humankind made in the image of God, precious to God, who have fellowship with God, who've, told not to eat of a certain tree of the knowledge of good and evil, given access to the tree of life, and then sins, and then, despite being warned that they would die as soon as they eat that fruit. No, they don't drop dead on that day. And so it looks like spiritual death to me. They experience this spiritual death. And then the whole of the rest of the Bible is how that relationship with God is restored wonderfully through Christ and through his death and resurrection. So I love to emphasize the big picture here very much. So coming back then to Adam and Eve as being the Adam, and of course another point that I always come across when I read the Bible, early chapters of Genesis, is that Genesis chapter 1, of course, uses the word Adam as humankind, male and female, he created them. So the whole of humankind is made in the image of God. That's a great manifesto that we have at the beginning of the Bible. Then Genesis 2 and 3 refer to the Adam, the man, many times through Genesis 2 and 3. And in Hebrew, you don't put the in front of a personal name. Okay, it's not a personal name. It's, if you like, a representative name, representing man, representing woman, and so forth. So that idea, I think, comes across quite strongly in chapter 2 and 3. But then by chapter 4, whatever it is, chapter 4, verse 21, isn't it? You've got Adam then presented clearly as a person who's having sex and having a family, okay? So a biological human, right? Okay. And then you have a genealogy, stemming from Adam and so forth. So you've got three quite distinct uses of the word Adam in the first chapters of Genesis. And I think that's very important, actually, and very important for our interpretation, our hermeneutics, if you like, of how to handle those texts. But I think overall, if someone says, well, taking the Bible as a whole, does it look like these Adam and Eve were real people? I think it looks like that to me, certainly, And so and then you go, well, what kind of people are we talking about? And so the model I quite like is the one which was introduced here in this country strongly by the late rector of All Souls Langham Place, an Anglican church in the middle of London, which is still there and thriving away. This is the Reverend John Stott. And he introduced this language of Homo divinus, the divine humans. Comes rather from C.S. Lewis, I think. I'm never quite sure if he got it from C.S. Lewis, but you get a similar idea in C.S. Lewis. Basically saying, look, the early chapters of Genesis, and they're not about human evolution. That's not what they're about. Okay, of course we need human evolution to happen in order to have the capacities that we need in order to be made in the image of God by God. But that's not the whole story. No, it's not the whole story at the beginning and not the whole story now. So we humans walking around the streets of Cambridge now, we can have all the capacities to have fellowship with God, but we don't know God personally because we've never come to know him personally through Christ. Well, if you go back to the beginning, then according to this model, those early humans that God chose, he chose a couple or a family or a community. I'm not sure it's that important, but maybe he chose a couple to come into fellowship with himself. He revealed himself to them and gave them responsibilities to care for the earth and all those other great responsibilities that we know about, that we have now as Christians and which they had at the beginning and which they then destroyed and broke, sadly, through their sin and disobedience. So it's that kind of model. It's a theological model, if you like, which doesn't have anything really to do with human evolution, at least not in any direct kind of way.
Now, if I can jump on some of that, the data, let's call it that, the data for this argument of who was Adam is based on, you began talking about the New Testament people who carry a lot of weight. And I think really all we're talking about is Jesus and Paul. I'm not aware that James or Peter or John wrote about Adam and Eve, but we have references from the mouth of Jesus and from the writings of Paul. And so maybe we can talk a bit about that. The passage that everybody points to is that one part where Jesus is talking about divorce, and you may be able to quote me better here. Either one of you can probably quote me better here, but basically Jesus is saying, don't you remember back in the beginning, God made the man and wife, and the man left his father and mother and joined his wife. And they think that's Jesus saying, see, Adam and Eve were real people. But the thing is, the wording is, as you said earlier, Dennis, there's wording that where Adam can be a person, and there's wording where Adam is humanity, represents all of humanity. And here, Jesus is talking about divorce, not about human origins. He's talking about a social issue, divorce. But more importantly, he talks about how this man who joins to his wife left his father, and maybe he's speaking more generically. These men join their wives, and they leave their father and mother in the process. Adam and Eve never left a father and mother. So clearly, Jesus is talking generically about men and women and marriage and divorce. He's not talking at all about human origins, I would argue.
I entirely agree. And of course, many translations say Jesus is saying male and female, he made them. So he's referring to, he's referring to them as generic male and female, and just talking about divorce. I agree. No, I agree about that.
And not at all about origins. That's the key point. He's not talking about human origins.
I agree, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, so I think we're agreed on that one. Sure, yeah.
It also seems to me that the main concern in the Old Testament with the Old Testament theology is, of course, the nation of Israel, and the fact that God has called out a people for himself, a people that he chooses. They didn't choose him, and he chooses them to reveal himself to them. And if you look at the Adam and Eve narratives in that context, to me, they're kind of the founders of that nation. They're really the first called out people that God enters into that relationship with. And the Old Testament, especially Genesis, is not concerned at all with obviously genetics, but with the idea of, were these the first people and so on, because immediately you have the story of Cain, where Cain asked to be protected. Well, protected from what? And the author doesn't care, because that's not the point. The point he's trying to make is that God, chose these people to enter into a relationship, but that relationship was broken. And so the whole history of Israel unfolds as God calling that people back, eventually, of course, through Christ, as we believe. So looked within that context, that to me sheds a lot of light on the whole debate.
Absolutely, yes. And I would see Homo divinus, if you like, as, monotheistic Jewish precursors in that sense. And, I would see them as the first family. God wants to create a family of people who love him and worship him and serve him on this planet Earth, okay? And so I just see it had to start somewhere. It had to start somewhere, and because here we are. And so when did it begin? We don't know when it began, but I mean, it's sort of a picture of God revealing himself in such a way that would, by his grace, that would make that first family possible. And so if you want, and maybe this is probably my brethren background, but I sort of envisage somewhere, in the Near East at some stage, a little group of believers sort of meeting together, believers in the one true God, surrounded by all this other stuff that didn't really help them. There are lots of people around, obviously, but they were the ones who really worshipped the one true God and knew him personally and could talk to him in prayer. They prayed together. So I have that sort of rather nice picture in my mind, but that's getting a little bit speculative, but that's sort of how I would, that's the kind of model I like, I must say, which could be quite recent, I mean, I think it's part of the problem, actually. I mean, maybe we'll come to William Lane Craig's book, and he wants to put Adam and Eve way back in 750,000 BC years ago in Homo heidelbergensis, but I think obviously the cultural context of early chapters of Genesis is, the Near Eastern, ancient Near Eastern context. And that is the revelation of God to us, written for them. It's written to them, written for us as well, clearly, and all over the world, but written to a certain set of people. And so I think to extract out Adam and Eve out of that cultural context is a big wrench. I think it's really a big pull. I don't see there's any need to do that, actually. I would want to place them within their own ancient Near Eastern context. Of course, I don't see them as genetic progenitors of the whole human population. No, not at all, no.
And we're going to talk in a minute about that genetic versus genealogical and heidelbergensis as well. But I'd like to wrap up, if you don't mind, this last piece of evidence. You were talking about the New Testament authors and how they carried so much weight. So let's talk about Paul. Paul clearly did. The writing seems to clearly suggest that he thought there was an actual Adam, or at least he writes as if he is assuming that. But he's doing so in the process of trying to make a theological point. That story he's telling is no longer just a Jewish story. This is now a story for all people. And so he's trying to bring all people, Jews and Gentiles, under one umbrella so that he can tell that his story applies to everybody. So he's making a theological point. I don't know that he really wants to fight for this interpretation of human origins that Adam and Eve are the primal couple. But even if he did think that, the thing is, Paul was a man of his day. He also believed in a very literal underground hell. And he believed in their Jewish idea of the cosmos, that there was a third heaven. He talks about knowing a man who was taken up into the third heaven. He absolutely believed that hair length was critical, was crucial. Men have to have short hair, women have to have long hair. And he said, look, you just look at nature, it's obvious. That's the way it is. So he was a man of his day. And so maybe he did believe that there was a literal Adam and Eve, because people in his day, people of his cultural context believe that. But does that mean we have to believe that? We've given up all those other ideas that I just referred to.
Yes, I know this is a very big discussion. Obviously, I lived in the Middle East for 15 years, and it's wonderful to read your Bible in the Middle East, in the midst of Middle Eastern culture, and it really makes it come alive in a rather wonderful way. And so I'm very sympathetic to those kind of points, in the sense that we don't have to, go along with all the cultural assumptions made necessarily, obviously, in the New Testament. And I think disentangling the cultural assumptions from, if you like, historical things, the way things actually happen. So it's always a difficult one, isn't it? And of course, the New Testament treats the Old Testament as things that happened. Abraham was called by God, man of faith. And so Paul centers a lot of his theology is around, justification by faith, and for, those who are justified by faith in the Old Testament, referring to them as real historical people. I suppose if I can use the phrase devil's advocate in this context, which maybe isn't the right phrase to use, but, I suppose I would point out that yes, but Paul also understands a lot of his theology in the context of Old Testament figures that he takes to be historical.
Right.
And I think most people would see Abraham as historical, I think we would probably see that. And I think Jewish people certainly would see Abraham as a historical figure, and Moses indeed, and so forth. And then, so in other words, I think you have to be a little bit careful to deconstruct, if you like, some of the passages. As in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. Well, Christ is definitely a real historical figure. And it'd be probably quite hard, I think, wouldn't it, just to deconstruct that and just say, well, this is Paul's way of teaching theology and so forth. I'm not quite sure I take that. I think that parallel to me seems pretty strong, and therefore I would be very careful before thinking that we should just do away with any concept of Adam as historical figure, I think. I think the theology would still stand, it would stand without that. But it seems to me a bit tricky to start deconstructing too much. Otherwise, you lose a lot of the historicity of the Old Testament, I think. I think that's the problem, really.
Now, I'd like to pull out a couple more books from that large stack that we referred to. We were talking about the large number of books that have been written about Adam in the past 10 or 20 years. It's interesting to compare them face to face or back to back, however you want to say that, because they come to completely opposite conclusions. So on the one hand, you have Denis Venema, who works in genetics, your field, Denis, and he wrote in his book, Adam and the Genome, about how science, according to how Denis portrayed it in his book, science absolutely contradicts the idea of a recent Adam and Eve. But then we had Joshua Swamidass a couple of years ago putting out his book. And by the way, he's a computational biologist, and we talked to him last week. In his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, he showed how it was indeed totally possible to accept the idea of a recent Adam and Eve, as long as you were talking about genealogical relationship and not genetic relationship. So anything that you want to say on that, Denis?
Well, I'm not an expert at all in Joshua Swamidass's views. And to be honest, I have read an article by him. I'm somewhat familiar. But if you had him last week, you're probably much more of an expert on his views than I am. But my understanding is, and you please correct me here if I'm wrong, I don't want to misrepresent his views in any way. Yes, I understand that he's putting a big focus on the genealogical arguments, if you like, rather than genetic arguments. I think my understanding is that he perceives Adam and Eve as being a real historical creation by God, almost out of nothing, not out of nothing, but out of the dust and so forth, in the Garden of Eden. And as it were, that's surrounding it. Everybody else outside the Garden of Eden, that's where everything else happens in terms of evolution and, all the genetics we know about and all we describe. And so he kind of makes a sharp distinction between what's going on in the Garden of Eden, as it were, contrasted with what's going on outside. Do I have that right? You can correct me if you've just been listening to him, but that's my understanding.
So there is a camp that believes exactly that they believe, okay, yes, humans evolved in the standard way that the scientists tell us, and we have Neanderthals and Denisovans and chimps and orangutans, and of course, what we call humans ourselves. All of that, they would say, yes, yes, yes. And then they would say, but then either God took a pair of those, set them aside in a little garden, and refurnished them, upgraded them. And that's where the biblical story begins. Or this idea of a de novo creation, that God, for whatever reason, used the exact same genetics and the same, general anatomical structures and everything, but created a new pair of these organisms that we now call humans. And that's where the biblical story starts. Now, to answer your question, Joshua did refer to that, and I don't remember that he solidly planted his flag on the one side or the other, but he did refer to both of those versions of the story. Scott, do you remember anything in particular?
No, that was my understanding too.
Thank you. I mean, so just the latter of those two options, I mean, the idea of creating Adam and Eve out of the dust and then giving them a genome that looks like it's old and it looks like it has the history of our evolution, even though that isn't true, I find that problematic, okay?
Deceptive.
Because it looks like deception. I mean, I don't believe in God as a deceiver. I believe in God of truth and a God who reveals himself through the two books we were talking about earlier on, and therefore the book of creation that we study as scientists and enjoy studying, if that tells us, well, our genome looks really old, it just would be, to me, totally against the character of God, against his character of truthfulness, to create out of nothing, and not out of nothing, out of dust, but not in an evolutionary way, beings who appear to be old.
Well, I mean, the psalmist talks about the heavens declaring the glory of God. There's this whole thread in the Old Testament that when we look at nature, it points us to God. But if what that view is saying is true, just the opposite is happening. God has created something that doesn't point to him at all, and he's done it on purpose. I agree. That doesn't make any sense or comport with the whole view of God throughout the Bible, that he's a God of truth, that the creation reflects him and it can point to him and so on. So maybe just not in the way that we thought. So that's where we have to rethink things when we learn more about the world. However, it still does reflect.
Yes. And I think the other point I would want to say is, to me, it's not really very important to have a special creation physically, in any physical sense, of an Adam and Eve. Okay, and as you can tell from what I was saying earlier on, I see it more as a theological revelation of God and personal revelation of his purposes to a couple. I don't think anything physical changed in them, okay, at all. I don't think that's necessary at all for the kind of model that I was presenting. The model may be wrong, but that's the model I'm presenting. And so this whole genealogical emphasis, which obviously is aiming to lead back to a couple, not genetically, but family history-wise, to me, I'm not quite sure what the point is, actually, but that's because of the hermeneutics of Genesis 1 to 3, really. Yeah. So there is a hermeneutical difference here.
Right.
Our background discussion here. Yes.
Well, here I think I can speak to his motivations. I wondered that too. Why does he want to point back to a couple? And it's not that he's trying to legitimize original sin or anything like that, or at least so he says. Instead, what he says his motivation is he wants to show that you can believe evolution or not. You can reject the whole idea of evolution, but you can't on scientific grounds. Equally, you can believe in a primal couple, Adam and Eve, or you can say, no, there never was, but you can't on scientific grounds. That's his point. He just wants to show that scientifically you can go either way on that question and have legitimate justification for saying why he could point to a primal couple one way or the other. That's what his motivation is, just to say you can't reject either of these two worldviews on scientific grounds.
Okay, well, it's great to have all the different ideas and models. I'm all for it.
Right.
Let 1,000 flowers, I say, but yeah.
So I want to pull another book out of that pile and compare it again. So Joshua clearly made the point that we can talk about a recent Adam and Eve, even going back only 2,000 or 3,000 years. But then we saw a book come out just last year, which goes to the opposite extreme. William Lane Craig, a philosopher, he wrote in his book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, he traces Adam back several 100,000 years ago and to not an ancient human as we would understand, or at least as I think the three of us would call a human, but rather to Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestor of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And Dennis, you reviewed that book. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, thank you. Yes, I have read the book and I have reviewed it, and it's got 421 pages, so it's not to be undertaken lightly or wantonly, we should say.
And you said footnotes that are a page long.
I know. What amused me slightly, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but at the early part of the book, he says, this is not an academic book. This is a popular book. And I think, and then I come to a page full of footnotes, and it looks like an academic book to me. Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting book. I always enjoy reading all these different ideas. As I say, let's have lots of ideas. And he spends the first 200 pages kind of expounding Genesis 1 to 11 as mytho-history, which I find interesting. I don't quite know why he uses the phrase mytho-history. I mean, theological essays, to me anyways, it's more, anyway, we can discuss what to call them and so forth, I suppose, spend a lot of time on that. But that's why I'm a bit puzzled why he's obviously very keen to have a literal Adam and Eve, but he does make that clear. And he's not fussed about original sin, interestingly. He doesn't think that's not an issue for him. He's not even sure the Bible teaches original sin, comes through in his book. But the reason, actually, he wants to have a literal or physical original Adam and Eve is simply because of what we were talking about in the New Testament. It looks like the interpretation, at least of Paul, of the Old Testament mentions of Adam and Eve saw them as historical beings. And so I think that's his motivation. And he feels, the gospel is at stake because if they were wrong, then we don't have to believe Paul because he was wrong, you see. So that's the sort of philosophical, if you like, position that he's taking here. And anyway, he then goes back, as you said, to suggest that his Adam and Eve would be in Homo heidelbergensis around about 750,000 years ago, and so on. And I think the reason I suppose he's trying to put them back then is because he wants them to feed into the genetic, not just the genealogical history, but I think genetic history as well of our evolution, certainly the genealogical history. And so he wants to put them early enough so they would come into Neanderthals and Denisovans and anatomically modern humans. So he would be happy to include Neanderthals, for example, as all part of this humanity made in the image of God, you see. And so it's quite a radical proposal in some ways, I think. It's and I think quite probably difficult to sustain, I think. I don't know if I can find the quotes here, but he sees the putative original couple as being the pioneering source, and here I quote from him, modern cognitive capacities. And so the author envisages that out of the Homo heidelbergensis population, and I'm quoting here then from the author, God selects two and furnishes them with intellect by renovating their brains and endowing them with rational souls. Only they are therefore truly human, close quote, page 378. So in that way, they become morally responsible. So he would then see this population, which come down, from this early couple, as being the morally responsible ones. These are the only ones who have real rational soul. Well, it's a very radical suggestion.
Totally.
I personally think it's got a lot of problems, but it again sort of extracts his Adam and Eve right out of the ancient Near East literature that we were talking about, and somehow that they're lost, their contexts are lost from the Genesis text. So I think that's quite a big step to take, really, to make that kind of step.
It seems almost like a form of de novo creation of that, like maybe not physically de novo in the sense that there were these physical creatures, but supernaturally God suddenly decides to endow a particular species with a soul and rationality. It also kind of indicates to me that he's a dualist, because the idea of some sort of, God injecting some sort of immaterial soul into the picture. So it just seems problematic on a bunch of fronts.
I think you're right. And also when we go back to Genesis 2, isn't it? I mean, we read that Adam became a living nephesh. He became a living soul. He wasn't given one as a sort of extra, but he became one. And of course, you read the animals became nephesh as well. Okay, so there's an interesting discussion there about stand the soul, but probably you may not want to go off in that particular direction. But that's a valid point. Thank you. Yes.
Now, Dennis, heidelbergensis, I need to be clarified in this because I would have assumed that Homo heidelbergensis would be a different species than Homo sapiens and then Homo neanderthals. I mean, we derive from heidelbergensis, but does that make them a different species? That's my one question. And that brings in the whole discussion on what does it mean to be human? Craig is really broad in the term human. But then a minor aside also, heidelbergensis, they came out, I think it was in Northern Europe. And if he's trying to reconcile this story with the biblical account talks about Adam in the far Middle East around Babylon. And so you've got a whole different geographical context as well, let alone that species question.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, in the sense that what's sometimes called in human evolution the muddle in the middle. Okay, so what do they mean by that? The people working in this area mean that, well, the past 300,000 years, we've got a lot of data and so forth. We've got fossil data, sort of physical fossil data. We've got all the genetic data to some degree with Neanderthals and Denisovans and so forth. Right. When you go sort of to the era of the Homo heidelbergensis, when you go from sort of before 300 up to, well, 1 million years ago, it's a muddle in the middle because there's a lot of conflicting data and it's quite hard. Different populations, there are different papers coming out about exactly where did the anatomically modern humans come from, and that gets very difficult. The data are not clear, to be quite honest. And therefore, there's a gap in our knowledge. There's a big gap in our knowledge there, actually. And so in a way, you can plant a model. If you want a model like Craig is putting in there, you can put that model in there because there's a big gap, you see. And therefore, if you have got a gap, it's much easier with your models. Okay, I'm sorry to put it that way, but then you can generate a theory. I think the problem, though, is all that we know about Homo heidelbergensis and their social lives and so forth is that they don't look like they've got moral capacities. They don't look like they've got the same cognitive capacities that anatomically modern humans had later on. They don't have the same sort of social structures. And certainly they didn't have civilization or cities and the sorts of things that didn't come about until, only 10,000 BC or whatever, that sort of era. So I think there's a lot of problems in that point of view. And I think, again, it comes back to how we understand the beginnings of those first humans who really had fellowship with God and knew God in a personal way. I don't personally think that's because they got sort of special soul stuck in them or something, although I can see the rationale for that if you're a dualist, but which I'm not, by the way. And so I see it much more in relational terms. At what point did humans have the capacity that they would have, language, and they would have moral capacities, and they would have all those abilities that would enable them to have fellowship with God? What they lacked was to know God personally. And then I think there was an act of grace by God to give them that possibility. It wasn't that it wasn't bottom up at that point. So the change was their relationship with God. That to me is what the whole thing's about, really. So it depends where you're coming from, doesn't it, in this discussion, I think. What you think the whole Adam and Eve sort of story is really about, in that way, I think.
Mm.
Well, there's so many more books in that pile that I want to pull out and talk about with you, Dennis, but we are getting short on time. Before we go, is there anything that either one of you, Scott or Dennis, that you think has been left out and that we should discuss before we put an end to this one?
Well, the only thing I want to underline really is that things are changing all the time. And, there are new data coming along. And since even I wrote the second edition of Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? Lots more data out there. Things are changing all the time. So I think we need to hold on to our models lightly. And, I don't mind if somebody has another model, and that's fine. I think we need that sort of attitude towards this, because I know that some people get very embedded in certain models and they just want to defend them come what may. To be honest, I don't think the data justifies that. And my model, or John Stott's model, if you like, could be wrong. Okay, so let's move on. Let's find a better model. And so I just think I want to get that message across. We need to be careful about not being too dogmatic when, the science data is moving on, hermeneutics is getting better, hopefully, sometimes. And so we just need to live with that, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Before we do go, I do want to hear a little bit more about what you're doing now, Dennis. You mentioned in your email that you've been working and writing on something completely different, behavioral genetics. Tell us about that.
Well, thank you. Yes. So the reason I got into writing about behavioral genetics was I gave the Gifford lectures back in 2014 at St Andrews University in Scotland. And of course, when you give the Giffords, then it really makes you think about, what kind of theme are you going to bring into natural theology at this particular point? The Giffords are all about, historically anyway, natural theology. So I was quite concerned at that point, and it partly arose, I suppose, from some of the hype coming out of the sequencing of the human genome. There were a lot of newspaper articles coming out about, this behavior being encoded by a particular gene. There's a gene for this, a gene, obviously the gay gene, there's a gene for aggression and a gene for sociability, etc., etc. And I got concerned about this miscommunication of the scientific concept of a gene. And of course, there are no genes, one gene for any behavior, either in us or in animals. So that's what really got me into behavioral genetics. And the Gifford lectures were really rather a review of behavioral genetics. Sympathetically, yes, I certainly think some wonderful work coming out of that particular discipline, but also a slightly critical review in terms of the overinterpretation of some of the data that were coming out of that field. And so out of the Giffords, I wrote a book called Genes, Determinism and God, which was really the book of the Gifford lectures, Cambridge University Press, which is a fairly academic book. And then, I was going to give a popular book to another publisher, but I had to, according to my contract, let Cambridge University Press know first if they would like a more popular version. I said, well, I know you don't publish popular books, and so I'm going elsewhere. And they said, well, wait a minute, send us an abstract. And anyway, they gave me a contract 2 weeks later. So that was the book that became Are We Slaves to Our Genes, which came out in 2020, which is a kind of popularized version, updated version, actually, of Genes, Determinism, and God. And so really what I'm interested there is asking the question, well, how much difference does genetic diversity, the kind of genetic diversity we were speaking of earlier, this 0.5% difference between all humans at the genetic level, how much influence does that have on differences in human behaviors? And that's really what the book is about. And in the process of doing that, I really want to defend free will, because I'm a strong believer in free will, genuine free will, libertarian free will. And I wanted to make sure that message gets across also in the context of genetics, because I think there's been a creeping genetic determinism, more at a popular book level, perhaps at a media level. I don't think so, particularly in academia, and I just wanted to counter that tendency to think in genetic deterministic terms. So that's what the book is about, really.
And that came out of the Giffords. Are you doing any other speaking engagements that we might want to know about?
Speaking engagements, well, there's always things coming up. One I could maybe mention is I will be speaking in Toronto, actually, thinking this is from Canada. And I think I jotted down the dates. Yes, July the 28th to the 31st, next summer. The American Scientific Affiliation have a conference, and they've been kind enough to invite me to speak there on the topic, can you believe it, are we slaves to our genes? So I will be giving a summary of the book, if you like, a little bit updated next summer, all being well. And so that's a talk that I should mention. In terms of books currently in progress, I've been co-editing a book with Alistair McGrath for the University of Oxford together. It's called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. That's the title. And both Alistair and I kept sort of bumping into people that when we got chatting with them, maybe at a conference or a Faraday course here in Cambridge or something, they got talking about how they become a Christian. And then it turned out quite a few of the people we talked about said, well, actually, Richard Dawkins played a key role in how I became a Christian. So we thought, well, that sounds like fun, so why don't we gather together as many, at least we got 12 essays now. So the book is 12 essays written by people from 5 different countries, from Australia, South Africa, Egypt, USA, and England. I don't think we have any Canadians. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, some are North Americans. And simply they're recounting the way that either Christopher Hitchens' writings and thought and lectures or Richard Dawkins played a role in how they came from, many of them, total atheists, strongly committed atheism, or agnostics, or in one or two cases, backslidden Christians, if you want to use that terminology. How they came from that sort of background to faith, the personal faith, life-changing faith in Christ through their writing. Dawkins stimulated them to think. I often say to student undergraduate audiences, just beware if you start thinking. Thinking is very dangerous. And if you don't want to change your lifestyle and change your life, then don't listen any further, because I want to challenge you about thinking. And when people start thinking, and of course the new atheism challenged a lot of people to start thinking about the meaning of life and what's happening and where are they going, what's life all about, and how do we try and come up with explanations about the existence of the wonderful universe that we see and so forth. Once you start thinking, it's, that can lead to personal faith in Christ. And that's what these essays are really about, actually. So,
have you had much interaction with Richard Dawkins?
Not personally. We chatted on the phone once about actually, when I was editing Science and Christian Belief, which a journal I edited for about 20 years, we had somebody called Mike Poole, who was philosopher of education, who wrote a critique of the early Dawkins writings. And so I wrote to Richard Dawkins and said, look, if we have a critique, we always like, the other person to give a response. And so Richard Dawkins wrote a nice response, actually. So we published that. I think it's one of the rare occasions when there's been a sort of rational and carefully worded, polite conversation between Richard Dawkins and a Christian philosopher coming out in the same journal, actually. And so that was, but then what happened was Mike Poole wrote back another response. And then I always remember it because I wrote to Richard Dawkins and said, well, obviously, we'd like you to have the final word. Okay, it's only fair to have a proper discussion. And I didn't hear back for a while. And then the phone went. When I was just having my breakfast in my pajamas, and my wife said, there's Richard Dawkins on the phone. So we had a nice chat, and he said, sorry, but I don't think I can write anymore. And the fact is, to be quite honest, and sorry, Richard Dawkins, if you're listening, but he's not a very good debater, actually, either in print or together with others. But one thing I would flag up, which if you haven't seen it, then it was a lovely debate, which only happened a few months ago on a website called Unbelievable, which is broadcast on Christian Premier Radio in London with someone called Justin Brierley. And so Richard Dawkins agreed to have a discussion, not a sort of debate, but more a public discussion with Francis Collins, whom he greatly respects. And Francis has kept up a good friendship with him over the years. And I just thought that was a very good exchange. It was polite, friendly, exactly the sort of exchange I think that should happen between Christians and atheists, where you agree to disagree, but you put your points across and you listen to each other. And I thought that was a great occasion.
So do you think he's mellowing out in his older age, or do you think it's that he's maybe being less convinced of his previous views or more convinced of Christianity?
I can't speak for him personally, obviously. A couple of years ago, he had a mild stroke. And his doctors told him that he should really not get too excited about things anymore. I'm only recounting what he himself has said himself, so it's nothing not in the public domain here. And so he has sort of mellowed a bit in that way. So I think that's happened. He also, by the way, several times he's quite happy to call himself a cultural Christian. I know he goes along, has done occasionally to the chapel in New College, Oxford, where he sits at the back, and he likes hymns, you see. Often reminds me of Thomas Henry Huxley and his people, if we're going back to the 19th century, and they used to sit around the piano and sing Christian hymns together on a Saturday, and on, probably a Saturday night or Sunday night or whatever it was. Because the cultural Christianity is very strong in certain circles, and it's still very strong in Oxford and Cambridge, actually. So I have good atheist friends, Lord Martin Rees would be one of them, our royal astronomer, who always went to chapel, when he was master of Trinity College. He's an atheist, but, that's what you do, because the chapel has a central culturally Christian life, and committed Christian for some people, life to the life of the college. So again, that's sort of part of our history here, which is, I know, very different from other universities, but it's just the way history works, isn't it?
Yeah, it is all fascinating, very interesting, and but we have gone over time. Dennis, I'm going to leave links in the show notes for where people can find you, where you're going to be appearing, and how they can connect to your books. But with that having been said, I thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been incredible, very valuable.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for the conversation and for the great points raised, and long may the conversation continue.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.